after losing his battle with a malignant brain tumor. We extend our sympathies, of course, to all his family. Stephen Colbert, you will remember that the Twitterverse became alive over the last couple of days with worries about Stephen Colbert when a couple of recordings of his fabulous show, The Colbert Report, were cancelled at the last minute with no reason given. Well, the New York Post is now reporting that Stephen Colbert's 91-year-old mother is ailing, and that is why the production of the show was suspended. If that is indeed the case, we wish Mrs. Colbert the very best. The Colbert Report is also the #3 search on Google. #4 is Pat Buchanan, the conservative commentator, dropped officially by MSNBC 4 months after they suspended him following the publication of his latest book, Suicide of a Superpower, a book which I have not read and therefore cannot comment on. #5, the underwear bomber. You remember Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab, sentenced yesterday to life in prison for attempting to blow up that airliner over Detroit, Michigan on Christmas Day 2009. He will spend the rest of his life in a very small room, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab. But, as I say, it's Friday Fun Day, so enough of all of that. Jim Pinkerton is here, Fox News contributor, and the man who puts the fun in Fun Day Friday. Also, we are, I think, ready with David Mercer, who is former Deputy National Finance Director at the Democratic National Committee. I should tell you, dear viewers, that the House has just passed the payroll tax cut legislation, and you're now looking live at the Senate floor, where we expect a vote within this hour on that same legislation. It will then go to President Obama for his signature. Obviously, this renews the payroll tax cut for something like 160 million working Americans. Jim, Republicans, on the face of it, just backed down and said, this is a political issue in a campaign year, we just have to let this go through.
Right, and to pursue it a little further, we're losing on this issue, so let's get it behind us, make it go away.
Good decision?
I mean, sometimes in politics things are so overwhelming. 160 million people and a tax cut versus what? You know, the principle of smaller deficits. Well, I mean, whenever the voters get a choice between things they want or deficit reduction in some abstract way, they take the things they want. That's just a reality.
David, is this a victory for the Democrats? Is it a victory for President Obama, or is it simply a victory for the American people, or those 160 million?
I think the latter, primarily the 160 million people that Jim just referred to, American middle class, which needs a boost, which will help create demand. And with demand, as we know, we get hiring and job growth, and people want to start, you know, getting out of what I think is an economic cabin fever. And, you know, it's good that the Republicans have finally seen the light to march in step with both public opinion as well as the leadership in the administration, President Obama, and Democrats in general.
So where do we go from here, though, Jim? Because what this doesn't do, as Speaker Boehner has just pointed out, obviously, is tackle anything to do with growth or indeed cutting spending.
Right, right. And that's where President Obama now has some potential jeopardy on this, because as far as I can tell, this is sort of his one specific economic plan that he really said Congress must pass, and they did. Okay, so what's next? I mean, he had a bunch of stuff. His budget is so full of stuff that even Secretary Geithner said, look, we aren't really being specific here. We're just throwing it out here as general principles. So whereas I think in a perfect world from the Obama administration point of view, the Republicans would have said no on the payroll tax cut, and the president would have said, see, do nothing Congress, rotten Republicans are denying half the country a tax cut. Now the Republicans aren't denying him a tax cut. So, okay, President Obama, what's your new plan now for actually getting the economy going?
David, what is President Obama's new plan now?
Well, it'd be interesting to see if the Republicans put up as much a fight as they did in holding up on the payroll tax cut that they just passed when it comes to the millionaires and billionaires that President Obama has over and over stated that given the circumstances and the economic situation we're in, those circumstances would dictate that everybody needs to put their fair share to work, have a fair shot, and get this back on a level playing field where we're all working together. So that will be another, I think, battle that will be waged in Congress, and allowing for, hopefully, the 2% who have enough resources, to say the least, to finally have contributions and revenues, which we need to increase, which are at an all-time low, even lower than when Reagan was in office, at maybe 14.9% of GDP on revenues. So while we are cutting, and we have been seeing the positioning for cuts, we saw the market go down last week when defense contractors, Boeing and others, had projected earning, didn't meet expectations on that. And that's because of the defense budgets that are going to be cut, as well as other discretionary spending.
Jim, one of our viewers weighing in right here saying, will somebody please define middle class?
Well,
it's something we talk about all the time. And Richard Beckwell, this is, he says the left seems to think that only blue-collar workers count, in other words, the unions, and the right counts monetary income. How do you define that term?
I don't have a good definition.
Does anybody?
Well, probably, but I know from, I saw a poll one time that said 93% of Americans define themselves as middle class. I mean, so most people, I mean, so if you make somewhere between, say, 40 and 225 a year, you probably think yourself as sort of middle class and hard pressed, and even if you make 250 grand a year and you got a $10,000 a month house payment, you're thinking.
Sure, it depends where you live as well.
Family of four, family of five.
Yeah. Right, and I think, but the question though is yes, President Obama has talked about making the top 2% more, as David said, but he hasn't proposed anything. And I mean, he just took $8 million out of Hollywood in California for fundraisers. So he didn't go to them and say, well, here's precisely how I'm going to raise the taxes of all you billionaires and trust fund inheritors and so on out there who are financing his campaign. I mean, maybe he will, but he hasn't yet, and he did not do so in his budget.
David?
I think if you look closer, it's pretty amazing that those millionaires and some billionaires that are supporting Obama are doing so gleefully and enthusiastically, even though, marginally or almost negligibly, they will be contributing a greater share to supporting America's resetting of the course back to prosperity and stability and security for the nation as a whole. And they're doing that, as we've seen Buffett support the president and almost the face of the initiative to do so. And there are many others beyond Buffett. So, I think it shows that, we're in lockstep with the different varying income levels or classes, middle class and otherwise, in seeking that initiative.
Jim?
Or if one were to have a more conspiratorial turn of mind, one would say...
Which you have, obviously.
Which I might sometimes. The president actually has no real intention of doing anything on these make the rich pay, impose the Buffett rule, just as he hasn't so far. And what the Democrats as a category are counting on is that all the Bush tax cuts expire at the end of this year. And then they get a huge dollop of money from the government. I mean, and everybody gets a tax increase. Everybody, including the 160 million who just got the payroll tax cut. Now, it would be horrible politics in terms of trying to run on a giant tax increase for the country, but it would solve the deficit problem in a big way and do it without cutting spending, which we know the Democrats are loath to do.
David?
Well, we have been cutting spending, and it's been proposed, and we saw Leon Panetta, among others, putting forth those spending cuts. But secondly, to Jim's point, if I might clarify, we saw President Obama fighting very hard for the middle-class tax cut extension, Bush tax cut extension, back in December 2010. And he had to, because it was being held hostage by the Republicans, he had to concede to the 2%, which he did not want to do. They are due to expire, and the Republicans are likely to fight tooth and nail to have that renewed or extended before it does expire, and you will not see President Obama, I think, signing it this go-around because of the need for this country in setting a balanced, steady course.
All right, another of our...
He won't need to sign anything having taxes go up. That's my point.
All right, another of our viewers weighing in here, all for jury, who I think is J.D. Plant, if I remember correctly from his Twitter account, living somewhere up in Bangor, Maine, maybe. He says the president's new plan is the president's budget. Ask your guests, Mr. Hunt, what the plan is to pass that. Jim, is that a good point? The budget's dead on arrival?
Well, I think, Frank, in all fairness, just about every president's budget is dead on arrival, and I mean in both parties. And so what happens is that the system just defaults to a continuing resolution, and you know who knows what else. And the Federal Reserve just writes a check to somebody for a couple $1 trillion, and nobody really knows the difference. And that's my point: is you can do nothing. And Ezra Klein in the Washington Post has been making this point many times. Folks, if we liberals don't do a thing, we get a giant tax increase and we get a lot more money from the government coming come January 13, and let's just wait around for that.
But you do have the, Jim, you do have the sequestration of funds that still has to be worked out on whether that trigger gets pulled or not, to be held over whether it's defense spending or discretionary spending. So that is an additional element to ensure that we are meeting our commitments in trying to reduce the deficit as well as raising additional revenues. Again, you know, as a standard over the last couple of decades, the percentage of GDP that we had for revenues was at 18%. We're now down to nearly 14.5 or 14.9%. We cannot, given 2 wars, given the economic straits that we were in coming into 2009, we cannot afford to have our revenues decrease and letting people not contribute and, you know, and pay their fair share.
All right, I want to quickly get to the other issue that we always like to talk about here, the race for the Republican presidential nomination. Jim, how much trouble do you think Mitt Romney is in Michigan, and how much more trouble will be in if he loses Michigan?
Can I wait until you're after Michigan?
No.
Oh. Well, I'll just say this. You know, the mere fact that Santorum is ahead even for 1 minute in Romney's sort of more or less home state is pretty astonishing and pretty ominous. And so it's still, what, 10 days to go until the Michigan primary, the 28th. But the fact that it's even competitive is a bad sign for Romney.
Ominous in what sense, Jim? Ominous in the sense for him personally at this stage in the campaign, or ominous for the Republicans if he's going to be their nominee eventually?
Well, both, actually. But certainly ominous, and most immediately ominous for Romney. I mean, right. He just can't pull it together in terms of where the Republican base is. And a tribute to whoever did the Santorum TV ad, the Rombo one, which I'm sure is run right. on Fox many times, of a dead ringer for Mitt Romney, as far as I can tell. It's either Mitt Romney or Josh Brolin doing the ad. With a machine gun spraying right. the mud at people. It's a brilliant ad.
It is a brilliant ad.
It captured exactly what people have come to think will happen now. Romney will use his millions and billions to pound away on Santorum, and who knows if it'll do or not. But any voter paying attention will say, aha, when the negative ads come, just like Santorum said, and that's a valuable predicate for the Santorum campaign to lay. All right.
David, what do you make of Mitt Romney's issues?
I think he's in trouble, and Santorum, you know, being one of the few left standing among the many that have challenged Romney directly, has him on the ropes. And you know, it's more than just Michigan because of his stand on letting Detroit go bankrupt. And being from an auto family, a native of Michigan, and to walk back in there and make believe that he was part of their community and supporting their community when in fact he even wrote op-eds, you know, saying let the chips fall where they may. And what's going to happen is it's going to fall into the overall narrative of Bain and the questions raised about his career at Bain Capital and what really was the mission there. Was it just making money at the expense of others, or was it really to hire or keep people on the job? You know, given what he did or the stand he took in Michigan, you know, one has to question that, and especially in contrast to President Obama, who got all parties together. He got the auto executives, with Steve Ratner leading it as the auto czar, the unions, taxpayers, the communities together to come forward with a plan that was of mutual interest. He didn't stick his head in the sand as Romney will have, done, and especially when GM is now experiencing, all-time profits. So he's got a problem on his hands.
All right, David, stand by for 1 second. I've got to get to our correspondent, Doug McElway, who is in our D.C. bureau right now. Doug is a busy man, so we're grateful to be able to slot him in here. Thanks for finding the time, Doug. And I guess you've got some new information on this sort of ongoing battle, I guess it is, between the left-wing organization Media Matters and the right-wing blog The Daily Caller. What's the latest we're hearing on this?
Well, the very latest installment of this investigative series that the Daily Caller has been doing on Media Matters found that since 2003, its inception, Media Matters has collected $28.8 million in donations, overwhelmingly and not surprisingly from far-left interest groups. Because Media Matters, though, is a 501c3 and pays no income tax, it has to meet certain standards to maintain that tax-exempt status. The tax code says that it must not attempt to influence legislation as a substantial part of its activities or to participate in any campaign activity for or against political candidates. But interpretation of that tax code is very complex. Some in Congress are reportedly now considering hearings to examine Media Matters' tax-exempt status, including Senate Finance Committee's ranking Republican Charles Grassley. Grassley told the Daily Caller, quoting now, "The standards for tax exemption deserve review as a matter of good stewardship on the part of Congress," he said, "and it should be considered as part of any comprehensive tax reform." Here's a look now, Jonathan, at some of the major contributors to Media Matters. They include the Tides Foundation, George Soros's Open Society Institutes, also the Ford Foundation, the Sandler Foundation, the Schuman Fund for Media and Democracy, which, by the way, is managed by PBS host Bill Moyers and son, also MoveOn.org, and the Barbara Streisand Foundation. And the Daily Caller also reports that another chunk of Media Matters money, $400,000 of it, came from the Joyce Foundation for specifically a gun and public safety issue initiative. And that happened in the very same year that Media Matters founder, David Brock's personal assistant, accompanied him to public events carrying a concealed handgun. And of course, Jonathan, earlier the Daily Caller reported that Media Matters has apparently considered, I don't know if it was actually carried out, but they considered embarking on a campaign of hiring private investigators to spy on the private lives of Fox News reporters. I think that means you, Jonathan. And me, too.
My word, if they started spying on my private life, they'd get very bored very quickly, Doug. Thank you.
With most of us.
Doug McElway in D.C., thanks very much, my friend. Have a good weekend. Yes, this is all part of this ongoing sort of fight between a conservative blog, The Daily Caller, and left-wing organization Media Matters. Isn't it par for the course, this kind of fighting, Jim?
I mean, partisan fighting is par for the course, and ideological fighting is par for the course. But I got to tell you, I think it raised a lot of eyebrows just across the entire Beltway when David Brock last year said guerrilla war and sabotage. They're quotes, guerrilla war and sabotage are not the normal, and he meant it. He wasn't talking about sort of a metaphorical. He meant guerrilla war and sabotage. That was last year. Then this year, thanks to the Daily Caller, we discover it wasn't just him talking as some sort of rogue, unbalanced individual. It was, in fact, the corporate culture of the organization. That is pretty astonishing, and I think with Senator Grassley and others, I think there will be significant congressional follow-up on this and exactly what's going on here.
David, do you think this is significant? You look at an organization like Media Matters, which, as Jim said, did sort of declare war on certain organizations, including Fox News, and yet they have this tax-exempt status. Is it something that should be looked into?
Well, I think their mission, as I know it, having been at the website and knowing folks over there, that their mission is to have, like PolitiFact or other organizations that monitor the media, to do fact-checking and to get to the truth. And that's the war, is the war for truth, if you will. Now, a lot of people have problems with that. They are calling people to account, including this network and Daily Caller and others, and the commentary of it. There's Mediate. There are a lot of entities that are doing this. It'll be up to the IRS and others with regard to whether or not they're staying within the boundaries of their tax-exempt status.
All right, David Mercer, former Deputy National Finance Director for the DNC. Great to have you with us today, David.
Pleasure
have a great
to be
weekend,
with you,
my
Jonathan
friend.
and Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim